Welcome to Anatomy of a Strategy. My name is Tara Hunt.
And I'm Carlos Pacheco.
Who are we talking with today?
Oh, we're getting right into it. We are talking to April Dunford. She is a speaker, consultant, and author. She is a positioning consultant, an entrepreneur, a board member, an angel investor, an advisor. What doesn't she do? Her expertise is built on 25 years as an executive in a series of 7 successful technology startups and 3 global tech giants. She launched 16 products as an executive and consultant on dozens more.
Yeah, so I also want to mention, April is amazing, and she, the conversation we have is so incredibly insightful, but I do want to apologize for the sound, for my sound, as well as for April's a little bit. What happened was I had to stay at home with our ailing old doggy, and so I couldn't make it into the studio. So Carlos sounds great, but I did a lot of talking and I didn't sound so great. I didn't have the proper microphone, etc. And then because of that, we just said for April to find a quiet room, and she was in a space that was a little echoey. So apologize. Apologies up front. Hopefully the conversation and the context of it will be enough to help you overcome.
Yes, it is. Let's get to it.
So I am so excited, Carlos.
Yes.
We are here today remotely, actually on Zoom, talking to April Dunford. I've known April for a long time. Welcome, April, to the Anatomy of a Strategy podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so we've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, but for anybody who does not know who you are or are familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background is I actually spent about 25 years as a repeat vice president of marketing across a series of startups. And so that's mainly because all of the startups I worked at got acquired for the most part, except one. So basically, I was an executive at 7 startups. 6 of those got acquired, which resulted in me being an executive at 5 big global companies. And across all of that, I've launched 16 products into market. And so the last 3 years, I've switched more into consulting. And so I work mainly with tech companies, and my focus very specifically is on positioning.
Yes, and that's what we're going to jump into and really go deep into today, because this is an important, very important part of strategy. In fact, I would say that it is probably, or you would say for sure, it's the core of your strategy. Am I correct in that assumption?
Well, yeah, positioning is interesting. It's seriously misunderstood. So when I talk to people about positioning, I usually have to spend the first 10 minutes explaining what positioning is not, because people really don't understand it much. So I have a bunch of analogies on that. But the way I like to think about it is, if you look at everything we do in marketing and sales as the house, positioning is the foundation upon which the house is built. So if the positioning is weak, then it kind of doesn't matter how perfectly executed our marketing and sales tactics are. They're only as good as the inputs. And positioning is really the stuff that is the input to everything we're doing in marketing. At least that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, so it's the foundation, but what is it really? Like, not the textbook version, because I heard you speak just recently about how you went to marketing school after many years of being in marketing from having an engineering degree, and then looking at the textbook version of what positioning is and thinking, no, that's not great. But like, how would you define it even beyond the foundation for the audience?
Yeah, so my journey with positioning has been a weird one. So, I didn't study marketing in school, as you mentioned. I studied engineering. But when I came out of engineering, I got a job at a startup. It was on the product side of things, but I happened to report into the head of marketing. That startup got acquired, and then my boss quit the company, and I was kind of last person standing, and they made me head of the marketing department, which at this point I'm working at this big global company. I've got 50 people working under me. I got tens of millions of dollars of marketing budget, and I literally can't spell marketing. Like, I have no. So I decided I better learn something fast before they find out and fire me. So I got lucky in that I had a bunch of super smart senior people on my team. So I learned a lot from them. But I also took a lot of courses, and I read a lot of books, and I did a bunch of kind of sort of post-grad stuff, ad hoc. And if you go to marketing school and you ask about positioning, they will recommend that you read this book called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind by these guys, Rees and Trout. And that is an amazing book, and it does a fantastic job of describing what positioning is. And so if you read that book, essentially their description of, what is positioning, their definition is like, okay, positioning defines how your product is uniquely qualified to provide something that a well-defined set of customers cares a lot about. So that is a pretty big, meaty thing. That you're saying it's going to define what makes you different and better. It's going to define the value of that for customers. And it also defines who your target market is. And taken all together, it describes this is the market where you intend to win. Now, that's pretty crunchy. Like, so you read this book and you get to the end and you're like, whoa, that's a lot of stuff. And I'm going to have to figure out how to do it. I wonder how I do it. And you get to the end of the book and they're basically like, call us. like that's it. They're like, so content marketers that tell me content marketing is a new thing. I'm like, no, there's these guys, Rees and Trout. They wrote a book in 1982. And that's exactly what they were doing. The idea was you were supposed to call them. They ran an agency, an advertising agency, and they were going to solve your problems with advertising. And so this frustrated me, and I thought, well, that's crazy. We're a little startup. We can't call those guys. They work with like Coke and stuff. So what are we going to do? And so while I'm taking classes, I'm watching out for this, secret to actually do in positioning. And so I took this class at Northwestern University, fancy marketing school. And in the class, the professor gets, there's this module on positioning. And I'm like, great, we're going to figure out how this is done. So we get to the module on positioning, and the guy throws up this thing, which is the positioning statement. And, most marketers have encountered this at some point. But the positioning statement, if you don't know what it is, it's this Mad Libs fill in the blank style exercise where you say, we are a blank, and you fill in the blank for blank that does blank, as opposed to blank, and you're filling in who your competitors are and what your target market is and what your market category is, all the stuff that Rees and Trout talks about in positioning. You just fill it in the blanks. And so I'm sitting at the back of the class, and I had just done a repositioning of a database product where we thought it was kind of a personal use database, like almost like Excel on steroids that ran SQL. And we had repositioned that, and it was a dog, by the way. We couldn't sell it. We repositioned it as a embeddable database for mobile devices, like a completely different market, completely different go-to-market strategy, everything different, same product. So I'm looking at this positioning statement in the back of the room, and I'm like, but wait, how do we fill in the blanks, right? So I put up my hand. I'm like, dude, there's a blank there called market category. And I just repositioned this thing from personal use database to embeddable database for mobile devices. How would I have used this exercise to pick which one of those market categories was the best? And literally the guy's in the front of the room, and he did this whole like professor bit to me where he put his glasses down his nose and he looked up at me like over his glasses, and he did this thing where he's like, trust me, April, you'll just know.
That's amazing.
And I'm like, I have like a systems design engineering degree, right? Like I didn't just know mechanics of deformable solids. I didn't just know advanced calculus. No, and I'm working at a company full of PhDs. It's not like we're stupid. You don't just know this stuff. So this is like what set me on this course of like, there's got to be a way to do this. And apparently no one knows how, except maybe Reason Trout, but they're not telling. And so, if we're going to, there is no accepted methodology for this, which got me down this path of maybe I should build a methodology for this for people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, So, what do you use? Tea leaves, divining stick? Like
exactly. Chicken bones and dice. Like we're just going to, like we're literally pulling this out of our asses. Like that made no sense to me. And in fact, my experience up until then was there were a lot of marketers around at that time that were doing stuff that looked like arts and crafts to me as an engineer. I was like, well, how do we know that works? And they're like, trust us. You'll just, and I like, that doesn't, I think maybe you're bad at your jobs, and you don't want to know whether it works, but
yeah,
if it's not working, we should know.
And I think this plagues a lot of parts of marketing and the marketing world and advertising. Mm-hmm. A lot of this stuff is figured out in a boardroom with a bunch of people like throwing out ideas. So that's one of the things that we battle all the time. But I'm curious to find out, like, how did you find a methodology then, or have you found a methodology? I guess it's in the book, but you want to tell us a little bit?
Oh yeah, so I got it. And so I got one, and and it's one of these things, like there's lots of caveats around it. Like, it works for me and it works for the people I work with, but I only work with a small group of people. So your mileage may vary if you're doing some weird thing, but here's how I got to it. And then here's where I think it works. So how I got to it was I said, look, I'm going to like science this, right? So if I look at the positioning statement, what's important in the positioning statement is the blanks. If you read Raisin Trout's book, they very eloquently describe the component pieces of positioning. Not explicitly, but if you read the book 100 times, like I have, it's all in there. So I figured we're going to take the positioning, we're going to break it apart into little pieces, we're going to solve for the pieces, we're going to put them back in the right way, and voila, perfect positioning. So if you look at all this stuff, the component pieces are clear, and there are 5 of them. And so they are 1, market category, 2, your competitive comparables, 3, the unique features or capabilities of your offering, 4 is value. So why do those capabilities matter? What is the value in it for customers? And 5 is your target segment. So who are the customers that care about that value that you are therefore trying to sell? And those are the 5 pieces. So I thought, okay, these are the 5. All I got to do is figure out how do I get the best answer for each of those 5 things, stick them all together, we're good. But here's where everything gets complicated. If you look at those 5 component pieces and you start scratching at them, you'll quickly realize that the 5 pieces all have a relationship to each other. This is something else that the positioning statement doesn't give you any clues about. Mm-hmm. So let's pick any one of those. Or let's pick value. So the unique value that I can offer to clients or buyers is completely dependent on my unique capabilities. However, my unique capabilities are only unique when I compare them to a competitive alternative. So those things are all related. And then, what's my target customer segment? My target customer segment is completely dependent on the unique value I can deliver. Because literally, I define my target customer segment by the people who really, really care a lot about the value that I'm trying to deliver. And then the last piece is market category. Market category is, in essence, the context you wrap around your offering that makes that value obvious to those people. So where do you start?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Right? So where do you start? So if I'm going to solve all these things and everything relates to each other, is it a spiral? Like, my first idea was it's a freaking spiral and that sucks. We're going to have to just iterate through it and, pick a spot, start, circle around, build the other things, see where we get, test it. If it stinks, we spiral around again. And so for literally 5 years, I thought that's how we do it. And in fact, when I talked to most of the smart marketers I talked to, none of us had a methodology. We were just kind of picking pieces of it, putting it together, testing it. If it didn't work, we went back to the drawing board and came up with something else. And so for literally for years, I decided that's how it worked. That's why there is no methodology. It's because it's hard and it's a spiral and we just got to iterate and that's it. But then I had kind of a realization and it came from a bunch of different things. And part of it was doing a deep dive around Bob Moesta's Jobs to Be Done stuff, which the product
people... We love Jobs to Be Done.
Yeah, so I got thinking about that, and I got thinking, the starting point for this has to be a place where I ensure that my endpoint is clearly differentiated. But for me, going through a positioning exercise, I couldn't start with jobs because that didn't get me to market category. And actually, where I needed to start was with competitive alternatives. If I didn't start with competitive alternatives, I got to some nice positioning, but jury was out whether or not the thing was differentiated, and I couldn't tell until I went and tested it. But if I started with competitive alternatives and then flowed downstream from that, by definition, where I got to at the end was at least differentiated and unique. And so I started down that path and testing that. And then I came to this kind of neat realization where, we start with competitive alternatives. Then we could say, okay, what do we have capability-wise that's unique compared to that? And then we translate that into value for customers. And then I can say, well, who cares a lot about that value? And that's where I get to my segmentation. And now I got value and customers. So I can now have a think about what is the best market category to wrap around this stuff that makes that value obvious to those people. And this was my kind of eureka moment. Like we do it in that order and everything fits, and we should get to the best possible positioning. Now, the caveat to this is there's a lot of ways in that process to mess that up because you're doing it wrong. And the most common one, and this is where the Jobs to Be Done stuff sort of changed my thinking on this. The most common one is step one, where you're thinking about competitors. Most people get that step wrong. And because it's wrong, everything downstream is no good and their positioning is no good. So what they get wrong about competitive alternatives is they're thinking about competitors. So the vast majority of stuff I work with, I go in and I say, well, who's your competitor? And they'll say, oh, we got competitors. And they'll list all these dinky little startups that literally nobody's ever heard of. Like each of them has like 2 customers. So then they'll list them all. And then I'll say, okay, that's your competition. So what have you got that they don't have? What's your unique capabilities, your unique value? And they'll say, well, our big thing is ease of use. So, if you look at each of those little startups, when you go to do this thing, it takes 29 clicks, and on ours, it only takes 1. So that's why everybody buys us. It's ease of use. We're amazing, whatever. However, then you go talk to their customers, and you say, look, customers, if these guys all got hit by a bus tomorrow, and this product didn't exist anymore, what would you do? And the customer says, I don't know, man, I'd probably use a spreadsheet, or maybe I'd hire an intern, right? So your competition is actually intern. Like, do you honestly believe you're going to beat the intern on ease of use? No, the intern is totally easy to use. It's like, Joey, get out there, get me a coffee, fill in the spreadsheet, come on back when you're done. Like, you're never going to beat Excel for an Excel jockey on ease of use. So if you get the wrong comparable at the beginning, everything downstream is bad, and a lot of bad positioning comes from a misunderstanding of the comparisons that customers are actually doing. So that's my long-winded thing on this is the methodology, this is how it works.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I love that you brought up the spreadsheets, because we've actually seen this a million times. When we sit down, and we don't do positioning ourselves, we do it, we come at it at a different angle. However, when we do ask to name, the competitive alternatives in our own way, we get a very similar answer. It's like, here are these big companies or these little companies. But then when we dive in, we have found it's usually a spreadsheet. And it's, in our case, it's quite often Google Sheets, that's competing, not even
B2B software. That is generally the good markets in B2B software you're competing against Excel, or you're competing against Google Sheets. So you're competing against brute force manual processes with a bit of, generic documents and spreadsheets thrown in the mix, but you're not actually competing with other purpose-built software.
Yeah, and we use spreadsheets for a lot of things, by the way, that they actually continue to be our backup. If you think about, if I look at a lot of our processes, whether it's, we have Asana for project management, but we still do a lot of stuff in spreadsheets as well, like as a backup. Our content planning, we use CoSchedule, but we also do a lot of stuff still in the spreadsheet. So,
and it makes sense, right? Because they're easy, they're fast, they're free. Like, it's hard to displace a spreadsheet. People, it's hard to displace a spreadsheet. You're going to have, and it can't just be, and again, you're definitely not going to displace it with ease of use. Because that is why we use the spreadsheet, because it's easy. I can just plop this stuff in there. There's no learning curve. Everybody knows how to do it. We're good with that. And so, like if you're going to displace the spreadsheet, there's got to be hella value in going off that, because there is pain in making the switch. Everybody's got to learn it. I got to pay some money. I got to get onboarded, and like all this stuff. And so, the spreadsheet is actually often a fearsome competitor. And people underestimate that.
You heard it here first. No matter what business you're in, you are competing with spreadsheets and interns. And I actually think probably there is it's not just a joke. You could probably trace a lot of your alternatives back to that, I would imagine.
In B2B, so common. It's like every startup I ever worked at, there was a segment of our market where that's what they were using. And if we wanted to get that segment, we were going to have to prove that we could do this easier, better, faster, plus a whole bunch of other things than spreadsheets.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to sort of reiterate and see if I got this right. So you start with your competitive alternatives. You can determine that. Then you move to like what unique attributes you offer, I guess it is, that, makes it, 10%, 50%, 100% better than those alternatives, something that people will want to pay for?
It's unique capabilities, right? So,
capabilities.
And so it could be anything, right? It could be that, hey, Joey, when he fills out the spreadsheet, he makes a lot of mistakes. And those mistakes in certain situations are extraordinarily costly. Whereas our software never makes a mistake. It pulls the profile from somewhere else. Nobody has to manually key it. Therefore, you don't make that mistake. Therefore, you're going to save X dollars a year because, when you make that mistake, the XYZ happens. It's different for every industry, what that looks like.
Right. And that's something then that goes to the third point, which is that's something that your customers really value, that they need to have solved. I guess that's kind of where jobs to be done would come into play.
Yeah, the idea is you have capabilities. Those capabilities map to value, right? So it's like saying, why do I care that I got more megapixels on this camera than the other camera? Like, the megapixel count is a feature. The value is, I get a really sharp image when I zoom in. That's the value.
Right.
So,
and then that would help you determine the customer segment, because those are the people that would value the higher megapixel or the lack of Jimmy's mistakes.
right.
And then, of course, once you understand that, now you know what market category you're playing in. Am I getting this right as far as the step by step?
That's the flow. That's how it works.
Oh, that's a really amazing framework, and way more useful. And I actually read the recent Trout positioning book many years ago myself.
A bajillion copies. Like, you still, like, if you go to marketing school now, they still make you read that book. Like, that's the book. There's no other book. And it's awesome. Like, I come back to it all the time. It's an amazing book, but don't think they're going to tell you how to do it.
No.
You're just going to get
and I think
about it, and that's it.
I think you can still hire them. So that's, they can't give away the cow or whatever.
The daughter's running the agency now. Yeah.
There you go. So now that you have that, there's a lot of companies out there that, will say, well, I have multiple of these. Is that something you could do? Can you have multiple positions?
Well, you can do whatever you want. It just might not be successful. So,
right.
So here's the thing. In all the products I've worked on, which is like as an executive, where I was in-house, even on the ones where we were really big, like, and I worked on a couple that were, getting in the neighborhood of $1 billion revenue. So big, and you would think for $1 billion revenue, we would probably have lots of different positions in lots of different markets. And we didn't. We had one. So because, and this is extra important for smaller companies, it's usually quite rare that you have completely different value propositions for completely different market segments. And there isn't one of those that is actually your best one. And so what happens in startups a lot of the time is they'll say, we have 3-4 distinct markets. We have this one, and it's insurance companies, and for them we do this thing. And we have this other one, and it's like banks, and we do this thing. And then we have another one, and we do this completely different thing. So we have to have 4 different positions for 4 different markets, whatever. And then I say, okay, how many customers you got? They'll be like 25. Really? So you got 25 customers spread over 4 different segments. Like, and usually what happens, so, is any of those real? Like, do you actually know? Like, do you have enough traction in any of those 4 to really know that you're a good fit in there? What you have is a handful of customers in different vertical segments. Does that tell you anything? It may not. And in the work that I do, a lot of times what we end up seeing is there is a slice across all of those segments that is common. And that is actually the root of what your key differentiator is, therefore your differentiating value, therefore your definition of a customer that cares. We are very used to thinking about customer segmentation in terms of demographics and firmographics.
Yes.
In my experience, that is not nearly sufficient to be able to build good marketing programs on top of. So normally when I go through this exercise, a lot of companies will come in thinking, oh, we have, this split across things. But what we uncover in it is there is value that we deliver, and that value is horizontal and not vertical. And it doesn't matter what vertical industry you're in. What matters is a whole bunch of other factors. And those other factors could be anything to you have this particular business process, or you have this particular set of software that you use, which creates an environment where this value is really needed. Or you have customers that look like this, or it's a combination of a vertical industry plus your environment, plus your business model. It's usually a combination of a whole bunch of things. Once you can get under that, then what you've got is this very clear positioning that says, here's what we are, here's why we're different, and these are the kind of customers that are going to love our stuff. So it's quite rare that you have different positions, like for a single product, where you have these completely distinct different positions for different target segments. Now, all that said, you will have cases where, and I get this question a lot, where, I'm a company and I want to position my company, but the company has two products and those products are aimed at totally different markets and they do different things. So now what do I do with my positioning? And in those cases, what you have is you have an umbrella positioning for the company that says, look, we're a company that delivers blah, and that blah encompasses all your products. And then you are able to click down beneath that and say, so if you look like this, here's the offering for you. If you look like this, here's the offering for you. Or if you look like this, you buy both things and it looks like this. So you will have a hierarchy of positionings inside bigger companies. So for example, when I worked at IBM, we never pitched a product on its own. So we positioned IBM, we positioned the division that the product was in, and then we positioned the product. Because if there wasn't value in this thing being part of the bigger IBM, then why the heck were we even selling it? We had that conversation a lot. Like if we got into this thing where we were like, you know what, this being part of IBM doesn't, like adding the IBM story does not add additional value. If it didn't add additional value, why is it not a separate company? Why are we not separate, selling this thing off completely? So you will have this hierarchy thing if you've got multiple divisions, multiple products, and things like that. But you're still going to have to make sense from the company down to the individual products of how that positioning cascades.
Right. And it's funny because IBM, there's the famous saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, right? Is that so the brand itself then becomes, I guess, part of it as well, which is interesting. In this process, though, I mean, you were head of, marketing, whether it was kicking and screaming or by choice early on, but it sounds like there's a lot of things that go into positioning. So, who should be driving positioning in an organization?
Yeah. So here's my opinion on that. And I know it to be true because I've done it so much. The marketing and to a certain extent product management are generally the people that first recognize or suspect that there is a positioning problem. And then the question is, well, are they the right people to solve it? And the answer to that question is no, they aren't. Because if you think about a shift in positioning, like let's take an example, the one I mentioned earlier, where if we had a personal use database, that was the idea. It was going to be like a spreadsheet that ran SQL queries. That was the idea. Like, remember Microsoft Access? That I don't think anybody uses that anymore, but we were going to be the Microsoft Access killer.
So I love the Access, by the way. I loved it.
Yeah, it turned out it killed itself. But nobody wanted that, and obviously, so we launched the thing. It was a disaster. Nobody wanted it. But in fact, we were thinking about killing it. And one of the tasks I did as the head of marketing for this thing was I called every single customer to find out what they were doing with it to gauge how angry they would be when we shut it off. So we were trying to figure out, should we give them a lot of runway or a little runway when we tell them we're not going to support this thing anymore? So I did all these calls with all these customers. And what I uncovered in all those calls was the vast majority of customers, they bought it, but they weren't really using it. They didn't care. I could shut this thing off. No one was going to cry. But I had a handful that were using it in this weird way. And what they were doing was they were putting this database on a laptop. And this was back when if you bought a database, you could not put a database on a PC. You had to put it on a server because it was big and it took tons of memory and a team of experts to even install it. And, that's what Oracle was back in those days. But if you had a laptop, and laptops were crap back then and they had hardly any space and no memory, you couldn't put a database on a laptop. That was impossible unless it was our database, which because we were making it as an access killer, it had this super small footprint and you could run it on a couple mega RAM. It was amazing. You can put it on. So these people had this database and they put it on a laptop and they're like, oh, what's cool about your database? It runs SQL. So I could put it on my laptop. I could send my salespeople out. They can take an order in the field, bring it back and sync with the main database back in headquarters. And I was like, wow, what did they do before? Well, what they did before was they went out and they wrote it down on a piece of paper, and then they brought the order back into the office and rekeyed it in, generally full of mistakes, into the database when they got back. And so now what we get to do is we could actually do the pricing and configuration, everything else in the field, and just sync it up when we got back. Neat. So I have this flash of insight. I got a bunch of customers doing this. This sounds like we could reposition this thing into this, and this would be great. So do I get to make that call? Frick, no. You don't think the CEO is going to have something to say about that? You don't think development's going to have something to say about that? This impacts way more than marketing. So what I got to do is I got to go back and I got to convince the entire executive team to even consider it. And then the entire executive team is going to have to go through this positioning exercise. We're all going to have to feel good about it. We're all going to have to buy into it because we're all going to have to execute on it. That one's a good example because what did it change? It changed our complete go-to-market strategy. It changed the pricing. It changed the product roadmap. It changed absolutely everything. We were selling the thing like zero-touch sales one at a time. And now we're going to sell it to companies where we're selling hundreds of seats at a time. So I need salespeople. I need a completely different pricing structure. I need features built because we had nothing built in that could assist you in doing this sync between a laptop and a back-end database. So we had to, the guys that were using it like that had built their own. And so at the beginning, we give you a toolkit to build it, but we should have it on the roadmap to just ship that too. And all the rest of it. And I got a CEO sitting there saying, well, I kind of wanted to just shut this thing off, April. I can't make that call. So this is the thing about positioning. You'll sometimes get these marketing departments get all excited about a repositioning and then try to run with it, and they'll get shut down because this is actually a shift in business strategy. It's not a shift in marketing strategy. The marketing is just a piece of it. But as the marketer, or sometimes head of product or whatever, you may be the first one to notice it, but your job is to lead an effort inside the company to examine it, because you can't shift it on your own. So that gets people stuck. So then in the work that I do with companies, we are workshopping through your positioning, but I can't do it unless I get the entire executive team in the room, because I need sales, I need product, I need the founder, I need marketing, obviously, but I need development, I need customer success. I need everybody in the room, and we all need to agree that, this is why we're different. This is why we're better. And these are the customers that are really the best fit for what we do. And therefore, this is what we are. These are big, big strategic questions that the entire executive team is going to be involved in.
Wow. That's huge. And I have a question about that, but I think Carlos has a question in between this.
Yeah. So what are the examples of bad ones? That we're seeing a lot of news online about certain companies, but like what do you have like in terms of key examples that, people just chose the bad positioning?
Well, so generally, it's really hard to get big without good positioning at some point, right? So the vast majority of companies, if they have bad positioning when they're little, they just die. They just don't grow. It's like my little database thing, right? Like we likely would have just killed that thing, and that would have been the end of it, and nobody would have ever known that thing existed because it was crummy and no one wanted it. That was the end. But what does happen is positioning is not static. So you often will have a case where you've really nailed your positioning. It's fantastic. Market loves it. You're out in the market, and then things happen. And markets aren't static. So you have new competitors are coming into markets and leaving markets. Your buyers are changing. So depending on things like the economy or, cybersecurity threats are now a thing. And so we're now thinking about that when we're purchasing software. Like the way they think about a market changes. And so if you are not regularly checking in on your positioning, it is easy to get left behind or at least have a positioning that's very, very good all of a sudden go soft. And so there's loads of examples of that. And some of the companies that I've worked with have been bigger companies that have had exactly that, where things have been very good. And then there's a shift in the market. A strong competitor takes advantage of that shift in the market, and suddenly they're on their back foot. So I worked on a project when I was at IBM, actually, where we kind of invented a market category, which generally is very, very difficult to do, almost impossible if you're a really small company. But bigger companies occasionally have the opportunity to do this. So I worked on a project where we did a market mapping exercise of a big set of markets and determined that there was an opportunity for us to kind of redraw the lines around these markets and introduce a new market category. So at the time, there were a handful of quite big companies in the markets where we were going to touch that. And so we spent a lot of time with this is big enterprise software. So we spent a lot of time with Gartner Group, because they were influential with buyers and trying to convince them that this new market was going to emerge and it should be a thing. And we spent a lot of time with customers talking about this concept. And after about 6 months of working on this, we launched this new suite, a platform of products. And we gave it a name, and we said, okay, this is a thing. This is, information integration was what we called it. And then at the same time, Gartner Group was totally behind us. And so they came out and said, yeah, like we used to think of ETL and data federation, and, they listed off a bunch of markets as separate things. But we believe they're all going to come together into this thing called information integration. Here's our new quadrant. We're no longer going to be doing a magic quadrant for ETL and all these other things. Well, there were two players in the ETL market that were both big. Like they were both over 100 million revenue. What happens to them? So we know this thing. Gartner says, yeah, ETL is not even a thing anymore. We're all going to be information integration. And by the way, the purchase criteria for information integration is completely different than it is for ETL. It's way bigger. So all of a sudden, all these analysts and customers and everyone else are picking up the phone, calling those guys, saying, what's your information integration strategy? And at the beginning, they're like, dude, information integration isn't a thing. I may have made that up. That's bullshit. We didn't have to respond to that, all this stuff. But it was too late. It was too late. We had already laid the groundwork for this thing. We had tons of customers excited about it. We had influential people in the market excited about it. And what were they left to do? They had to react to us. And what happened was, what happened was, in the case of both those companies, they were publicly traded. Their stocks took a beating. They eventually were forced to reposition themselves as not so great information integration platforms, and we for them at a dramatic discount because they couldn't keep up with us, and so we just bought them and brought them in, and then our thing was really good after that. But yeah, so this stuff happens all the time, where a shift in the market happens. And you got some companies that are, they've been going great for like 5-6 years on this positioning that's working great. And all of a sudden, someone with my cheese. And you're going to have to respond to it. So in the positioning work I've done, like that product that I'm describing, the one where we position it as an embeddable database for mobile devices, that product exists today. Which is like 25 years later. At its peak, it was $1 billion revenue. It exists today inside SAP, and that positioning has not significantly changed. Like, they talk a lot about Internet of Things as opposed to just mobile devices, but it's essentially the same positioning. I have other examples of companies I worked at where, I had one where we built this product, and it was built on top of MySQL, and we had this really good relationship with the MySQL people. We had this great positioning. It was sweet. And then MySQL got acquired by Sun, and it was like, oh, crap. And so 6 months later, we had to readjust the positioning, take that into account. That was fine. That was all going good. We were happy. In fact, we were having nice, deep partnership talks with Sun. Everything's good. And then what happens? Sun gets acquired by Oracle. Then we're like, oh, shit. Then we had to redo it all over again. And then not only were they acquired by Oracle, but then Oracle's making all these new noises, like maybe we're going to get rid of MySQL. Meanwhile, we're out there talking up the fact that, it's all built on MySQL, and that's why you want to buy us. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, that positioning is going to fly right at this particular moment in time. So we had to go adjust it. So you don't know how long your positioning is going to last, and things are changing all the time. So you have to actually check in every 6 months and see, like, has anything changed? Are all our assumptions about the market still true? And you're putting out new features and things all the time too. So it's like, does this change our positioning? And if so, how so? Do we need to revisit it? So it's a constant thing where every 6 months, a couple times a year, you're going to check in on it and say, has anything happened in the market that would make us need to adjust this, and be vigilant about it?
Well, it sounds like being proactive about positioning is a better, position to be in than reactive, because all these examples that you just gave, those people that had to react, even yourselves, when MySQL kept getting bought up and shifted around, like, it wasn't, that reactiveness actually did not work very well in your favor either.
Well, the thing is, like, you can't always predict. In fact, most of the time you cannot predict what's going to happen in the market, right? If we could all predict what would happen in a market, we'd be sitting on the beach drinking out of a coconut right now. Like, everything would be easy. And so we can't predict what's going to happen in a market. I mean, we can be aware of potential threats, and we should be. Yeah. But sometimes things happen that, you just never predicted. Like, I worked at a very big publicly traded company that was doing $1 million revenue when the first big bubble popped. And I'm telling you, nobody predicted that. Like, nobody saw that coming. Like, and even when it popped, the vast majority of companies were slow to react, which in hindsight, you look at it and you say, God, why did they take 3-4 quarters to adjust what they were doing? Is because we didn't believe it was going to last.
Right.
And so, a lot of times you literally can't predict this stuff. The best you can do in some cases is, if you're regularly checking in on it and you have a methodology and a process to validate what you're doing, then you can at least react quickly. So you can't always predict the future, but even when you can't, you can still be on top of stuff, and not having a regular check-in on your positioning will definitely make this slower. And what'll happen is you'll be like a year later going, oh, geez, like maybe we're going to have to fix this.
Yeah, I also find that, having ears and eyes to the ground, and, a lot of companies seem to have lost their investment or their heart for, creating a branch of their organization that really is about looking forward in research and development. Very much like, you talked about at IBM, this idea of, you invented a new category. Well, that probably just didn't come out of nowhere. You saw something like a trend or something that you could tie yourself into. And I feel like IBM's really good at that, Watson came out on like sort of the tails of the big question of AI, and really defined this new category. So IBM's been particularly good at this over the years.
IBM's one of the few companies that still has pure research. Like at one point, tech companies all had pure research. Pure research meaning there are people inside the company that are working on projects that are not aligned to a revenue number or a business unit, that, the output of the research is not aligned to a business unit's revenue, which is very rare. They even back when IBM started doing it, only the biggest companies did that. And now there are very few companies that do pure research. But in some ways, I think that that's been replaced by just different innovation thinking. And so I think the best, biggest companies are not doing pure research, but they are definitely running innovation experiments, and they have teams dedicated to doing experimentation and thesis testing around business-related ideas that are very innovative, which aren't necessarily going to be big products right away, but they've got a sandbox or a place where that kind of, and it's not research, it's more like, innovation, prototyping stuff is happening. And having been exposed to both, like having seen the way stuff worked at IBM Research and then the way stuff is working now in some of these more, agile, nimble innovation companies, I think we're actually doing it better now than we've ever done it before. In that, I think we have the tools now with, I just went to a conference a couple of weeks ago, and the keynote speaker was Alex Osterwander. And I just have such a big respect for his work and his thinking. But I mean, that kind of thinking around how do you do, business model innovation, and not just product innovation, like innovation around all kinds of different axes. And then how do you run it through a process of, fast iterations and experimentation and seeing what works and what doesn't work really quickly. Like, that just wasn't a thing at IBM at all. And they're traditional. Then they do that stuff now too. Like they do this newer innovation stuff now too. I'm sure they do. But when I was at IBM years ago, the research lab didn't function like that. The research lab was, literally there were people with this title, IBM Fellow, and what you're allowed to do is anything you want. And the idea was that this completely open tech idea generation stuff would eventually result in a lot of commercializable things. And it occasionally worked, but a lot of times it didn't. There were a lot of things that were, in research that never came out of research that, that other companies managed to capitalize on and managed to turn into products and managed to leapfrog the IBM tech in a commercial way where they could get a product out and selling and whatever. And maybe IBM's tech was better, but they failed to take that tech and then commercialize it. So I don't know. Like I think we're actually smarter about this stuff. And I love that there's a dialogue about this and a big set of thinkers in the world that are thinking about innovation that goes beyond technology and hits on business model innovation and things we can do that are innovative that are not necessarily just product.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think there's arguments for both the sort of separate research branch and what you're talking about as well as this integrated and innovative thinking and rethinking business models throughout the organization as well. Ideally, then, do you do the positioning work, like the initial positioning work, before the product is built? Or do you do it like sitting and looking at the product afterwards? Is there can you do it at any point, or is there an ideal time to do that?
Well, you have positioning whether you've thought about it or not is the reality, right? So, but let's say you've ignored positioning and you've launched the thing out into the market and saying, I'm not going to position it. I'm just going to put it out and we see what happens. Customers will position it for you, and you may not like what they come up with. And there's lots of great examples of this throughout history. Like the most famous one is the Segway, right? So the guy that came up with the Segway was like the Elon Musk of his day. And he announced to the world that he was working on a new thing, and everybody lost their minds. They were like, oh my God, it's going to be so cool. And so he brought on this who's who of investors. Like Steve Jobs was an investor. He raised something like $100 million, which back then was an astronomical amount of money. John Doerr sat on his board. There was all this stuff. Everybody was so excited. But he wanted to keep it a secret. And so all he would tell people is he said, what we're building is a revolution in human transport. And so and that was it. And that's pretty poor positioning. It's so high level. Like, what's a revolution in human transport? Nobody knows what that is. And so everybody positioned it for him. And what they decided they were getting was flying cars. So everybody was like, we're getting a flying car. That's my idea of a revolution in human transport, flying car. People were looking through his patent list and all this stuff. So when he finally was going to announce the thing, people were so convinced they were getting flying cars. He got invited onto Good Morning America to announce the thing. Good morning, frickin' America. And so he gets on the TV and he's like, here it is, my revolution in human transport. And then they come out with a frickin' Segway. And people are like, what the hell? That's not a revolution. We don't even know what that thing is. No one knew what it was. And then even then he refused to position it. So people are like, so what is it? And, they talk to early users of the Segway, and early users would said things like, what the most frustrating thing about the Segway is? It's actually really a beautiful machine to get from A to B, but no one knows what it is. So if I drive it on the road, cars are honking at me saying, that thing's a scooter, put it on the sidewalk. Why are you doing it on the road? You can't drive that thing on the road. But then if I drive it on the sidewalk, ladies with baby carriages are yelling at me saying, that thing's like a car, get it out on the road. And so, the Segway was a massive failure. They thought they would sell 30,000 units a week. That was their goal. By the end of the first year, they said we're going to sell 30,000 units a week. It took them 6 years to sell 60,000 units in total. So a massive failure. And one of them, there were lots of reasons for it, but one of the reasons it failed was because they failed to position it. So the question is, how do I position, if you look at my methodology, it's like, what are the competitive comparables, blah, 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 blah. Well, how do I know all that stuff if I don't have any customers yet? And the best way to do it is you have a positioning thesis. You built the product with a bunch of assumptions in mind about, these are the customers that I'm going to sell this thing to, because the value I provide is this, and I've built a product with these features, and I'm going to replace spreadsheets or interns or whatever in this way. So you have a thesis, you go through the positioning methodology, and then you put it out there, but you do it with the idea that it very, very, very likely will change once you get it in market and you validate all of the assumptions about your product that are baked in. So one of the things I suggest to the companies I work with is, if you're just starting out, you actually want to keep the positioning kind of loose until you know who loves you and why, and then you can tighten it up. So I have this bad analogy that nobody understands when I use it again anyways, but it's a bit like this. Like, let's say you're building a fishing net, and you're like, you know what, we need a new kind of fishing net, and it's specifically for catching tuna, because I'm a tuna fisherman. I know all about that. And so I built this fishing net, and it's for catching tuna. So when I launch it, I could say, hey, here's the world's revolutionary tuna net or whatever, but I don't actually, and you know, tuna fishermen will buy it and go to the tuna part of the ocean and try and fish for tuna, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But I could say, you know what I got's a fishing net for big fish. Oh, any kind of big fish. Probably works for any kind of big fish. And then let people go out to the part of the ocean where there's all kinds of fish, chuck the thing out there wide, see what you pull up. And early positioning is a bit like that, right? You might say, oh, this thing is for large enterprises that do X, Y, Z, but then you find out, well, yeah, actually it is for large enterprises, but not X, Y, Z. It's kind of A, B, C. And so then you're going to adjust. So, you know, you cast the net out wide, you pull it up and say, huh, grouper, who knew? Let's go to the grouper part of town. Now we're going to make all kinds of So you tighten it up once you know. So in the work I do, I do positioning workshops with companies, and I charge money for that. So if you're a brand new startup and you haven't got any customer traction yet, you could pay me and work with me and we'll do something, but it may be a waste of money because the positioning that we get to is just a theory and it's likely going to change. So for most of those companies, I say, you know, keep it loose, go out, get a whole bunch of customers. You're going to have to do unnatural things to get them at the beginning anyway. And once you're starting to see the patterns of who loves you and why, then come back to me, and then it's worth the investment to actually tighten up the positioning, get it really tight so that you can say, now we got an idea of who our best fit customers are. Let's fix the positioning so that we're getting a whole pipeline full of those folks.
Wow.
Which is exactly what you said to us when I said, hey, April, we should talk because we're building something called Flywheel. And you're like, that sounds awesome. Do a beta test, get some feedback, and then we'll talk. I was like, okay.
I do it all the time, yeah. Because, like, again, would there be value in doing the positioning exercise when you don't have any customers? Yes, because, you know, any positioning is better than saying, you know what, I'm just going to flip it out there like, you know, Segway style. Let's just let everybody out there figure it out.
I'm going to say that from now on. I'm going to flip it out there Segway style.
Right. So then it's going out there and you're like, so at least being deliberate about it is always better than not being deliberate about it. But the advice I would give you on being deliberate at the very beginning is be deliberate, but don't get it too tight. Like, just keep it kind of loose. Like, you know, you don't have to be tuna. You can just be big fish, right? Like, keep it kind of loose and broader than you think until you see where you start getting traction, because we are crappy at predicting that. And customers do things that we don't believe when we get it out there. And there are all kinds of markets out there that we know nothing about that, you know, could turn out to be your best, beautiful, ideal fit customers, but you just don't know until you flop it out there and then you see, like, okay, who's loving my stuff and why. So keep it loose at the beginning, and then later when you start to get traction, that's a really good time to step in and tighten it up. And you might want to bring someone from the outside to help you do that, because you've been staring, by that point, you've been staring at it for so long that you might not see the forest for the trees, sort of thing. But, you know, it's better to get tight on it later after you already see some patterns.
And we know a good person for that.
Yeah. All right. I got the question of the moment. WeWork. Would you say that's good positioning? They seem to have been doing a good job for a while.
That is the most laughable positioning I've ever seen in my life. Like,
but they succeeded.
Like, honest to God, like the original positioning of WeWork was great. Like, you know, we're there's a whole idea of co-working spaces, you know, it was the right thing at the right time. But all that crap that came afterwards, like the we thing and, we're going to give orphans a home and the home is we company? Like, are you like, that's crazy talk. All that stuff was crazy talk at the end. And I think WeWork is a neat example of, I think, a company that did, a great job with the early positioning and really creating creating a space in the minds of customers about what they were. And later there seemed to be this attempt to stretch that positioning into like, we're going to do condos and we're going to have schools and we're going to have all kinds of other stuff. And those new attempts were utter failures because they did such a good job of the original positioning and the new stuff was so out there that everybody just ignored it. I mean, you ask anybody what WeWork is, they don't remember the schools thing and the homes for orphans and all that crazy, crazy stuff that came later. Everybody will say, it's a co-working space, man. That's all it is. And so I think the original stuff was really good. And part of the reason they were successful, although, I think the main reason they were, you could argue about whether or not they were successful in any real way. I mean, they did an interesting job of defining the space, and then they threw insane money at doing a market share grab that was clearly unsustainable. And so, now what happens? I don't know. Like, do you call it a success just because they opened up a lot of co-working spaces, but none of them ever made money and are ever likely to? I don't know.
Yeah.
That whole thing is just crazy. I mean, they were certainly successful at creating a space in the customer's mind, right? Like, what's WeWork all about? It's co-working. Like nobody doesn't know what WeWork does. It's just, that core thing resonated with people and it worked and whatever. But as a business, was that thing ever anything? I don't know.
Yeah, so they were really good at positioning, but they couldn't back it up with the actual business at the end of the day, I guess.
So there was never a business model to support that positioning.
No. Having run a co-working space, any one of us who have been in co-working for a long time, we just kept looking and scratching our heads saying, yeah, they seem to be really successful, but we've run spaces. We know how much it costs and how little you make. Like, this cannot be sustainable.
The crazy thing is they started to, their own expansion made that problem even worse. So, in Toronto, for example, they had plans to open something like 21 spaces. And so the rents in C-class office space in Toronto all went way up because all the landlords were like, well, we just got to wait long enough and WeWork will come in here and pay crazy money. And so, it was hard enough as it was when there wasn't WeWork, but that WeWork itself drove up the cost for all those things, which is why they were thinking about buying buildings, because it got to the point where they couldn't actually lease space because it was so expensive, and that was their own doing. The whole thing messed up from a business perspective. I don't know. I don't even understand it all that much, but the little bits I do understand, I'm like, none of this makes sense to me, but did to somebody at SoftBank.
It's fun to watch.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really great place, I think, to leave it. There's a lot of valuable stuff. Thank you so much, April. If I know that people that are listening here will want to follow you because they're now hooked to all of your ideas. Can you give us a sense of where they can do that?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's aprildunford.com. I'm not active on a lot of social these days, except with the exception of a bit of Twitter. So I'm at April Dunford on Twitter. And then if you want to do a deep dive on this positioning stuff, I have a book. It's called Obviously Awesome. And that came out this year. And it's literally everything I know, the big brain dump in one place.
And Obviously Awesome is definitely awesome, for sure. Sorry, go ahead, Carlos.
I was just saying we'll make sure to put all this in the show notes with a link to the book.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you so much for taking the time today. We will let you get back to your day and helping many companies position themselves properly. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much, April, for coming to the show.
Whoa.
It's always sort of like, I'm always amazed at the quality and like the experience of people that we've gotten on this show. I'm like, where did she work before? What did she? Holy crap! I can't believe we know this person. So yeah, April, thank you so much for coming on the show.